Hello, welcome back to Math Time with Professor Prime, and I'm your host as always, Professor Prime. So, I wanted to talk about math and self care at 4 in the morning. Take from that what you will. But I assure you, it is not unintentional. So here's how I want this video to go. I want to talk to you a little bit about self-care and how I absolutely approve of the basic concept, but not necessarily how it's implemented. And I wanted to talk about like the good in it and what I mean by self-care, as well as how, yeah, there are some issues with it, and how math is involved across the board because it always is, isn't it? Math's always there. But seriously speaking, um, I want to get into it. And like I said, I'm going to be talking about self care and how math's involved. So if you indulge me, I'll explain. But even if you don't indulge me, I'm still going to explain because that's my self care. But more seriously, I do want to touch on that too. So, like I said, it's 4 in the morning. Um, I deal with insomnia, among other things, and some of that is just my body being my body, and some of that is poor life decisions, or at least not the ideal one if I want to be healthier. But you know that it's a loaded way to talk about things, right? So anyway, with self care though, um, I know a thing or two about it because I don't practice it not well at all. At least like how we tend to think of it, right? Because these days it's become a bit of a buzzword. Like a lot of people use it, including myself. Hence me being here talking to you about it now. Because while I have in fact been a proponent of the idea of self-care, that is to take care of yourself mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, however that is, I do think there's an issues with how it's been implemented and how it works, you know, is a business among other things, right? um so let's get into that a bit more, right? Because like let's say, just focusing on the physical side for a second, um what goes into that? Well, I mean, it's going to depend um, on what works for you and what you think self care is for you. But there are some general things that you can consider and use as a guideline. And no matter how you cut it, math's involved, right? Because what if I'm dealing with exercise, right? Like maybe that's how I help physically as well as mentally, right? But that's going to take time. It's also going to take energy. And for some people, money. And I say that because there is a lot that you can do at home for both strength training and cardio without spending a dime on exercise equipment. Because you're still going to have to pay for food, right? So there's math in the time that you will use for exercising. And yes, it's a trade off because it'll help you out. And there's math in exercise itself, right? But there's also, in addition to that time, the idea that, hey, whether you're paying for exercise equipment or food, you're paying, and you might be paying for both. And with that food, right, it has different nutritional values, right? And you got to decide what works best for you and what is your goal with the exercising, right? Because it could be you're going for strength, in which case you might need some protein, right? Like, or sorry, more protein, but you don't want to overdo it because you might get it into your head that you think that you need more protein than you do. And I say that with a borderline judgmental tone because I'm talking about me. Like, I got into my head once that I needed more protein than I did. Um, but seriously speaking, right, it's a lot to keep up with, but you can. But back to that food, right? Like, you might be thinking about it in terms of like exercising and how that can help you feel better. But just in general, even if you're not super active, you still want to be careful of what you're eating and the nutritional value in it, right? And you want to get the right amount of calories. You might not want to overdo it on the fat. You might not want to overdo it on the sugar and the salt and all that, or sodium, rather. Um, but whatever the case may be, monitoring your food is very useful with self care. But what if that starts to stress you out? Then you might go the other way, right? You might get pretty hardcore with it. One of my things that I've done over time is like I'll go on kicks where I get like super healthy or healthier. Like I would get more conscious about what I eat, but I tend to overdo it because I overdo everything. And that is my way. That is the way. It's 4 in the morning. I just don't care right now. But so with that in mind, though, right? There's a lot of factors just with exercise, and then as a consequence, food, and then it's just like, are you exercising at home? Are you exercising at the gym? And if you're exercising at the gym, all right, chances are you had to pay a membership. Chances are it took you time to get there, and so you have a lot to consider with that. And this is just like the basic parts, right? Because there's more, right? So part of the other thing with just focusing on the physical health for like a second, although I will say, all of the stuff that I mentioned with food and exercise that affects your mental too, right? But with that physical side of things, like part of that is checking up, and I bring that up specifically, partially because the theme of the video, but also because I'm at a point in my life where there are some things that have transpired over like the last few months in particular that have been like kind of a buildup for years, whether I fully realize that or not. And I've been working to get better with some things health wise because like I am pretty careful about the food that I eat, and I am pretty active. I've been exercising pretty seriously since I was 13, and I'll be 36 this year. And yet, despite those two things, the body still will do what it will do. Which brings me to this point. Um, so when that happens, when stuff happens, or ideally before it, if you're taking care of the physical side of things, right? If you're taking care of that aspect of self care, um, that's going to take some time. That's going to take some money, right? Um, and the kicker with that is, right now, I happen to have a job that has decent insurance and flexibility in schedules. Flexibility in the scheduling aspect of things, where I have the time to pursue, options for better health for me. I have the time to do that. And the insurance, so it doesn't absolutely kill my pockets. But just to be clear, even with insurance, things are still not cheap. Um, but with that in mind, not everyone has that luxury. And just to be clear, I have been in that category, not even super far in the past. Things happen, right? Um, and sometimes all at once. And so while you're taking care of yourself and you're trying to focus on the physical aspect, not only do you have to consider things like food, consider things like exercise, you have to consider things like potential health issues that may pop up. And you have to also decide, like, hey, am I going to be proactive about this or that? Can I be proactive about this or that? And am I going to have the insurance to back it up? And if something goes south, am I going to have the time and money and insurance to, handle this or that, right? And you're dealing with math across the board with all that. Um, and that's not to say math is, you know, used badly or poorly in these cases. It's just like it's kind of a neutral thing, right? It's like you have a lot to consider that doesn't get talked about a lot with self care, and I want to hopefully change that conversation a bit better because I feel like you'll hear people talk about, oh well, you should practice self care more. It's like, I mean, yeah, we all should. But is it that easy? Is that simple, right? Because there's a lot that we choose, right? But then there's a lot that isn't precisely under control. And then if we get to the mental side of things, I mean, there's a lot of things that could play into, your mental health, right? You could already have some like conditions that are not necessarily greatly impacted by outside sources. And I say that the way I do because, right, there's always going to be some external impact on you. But that being said, you might be dealing with some mental condition, where it impacts your mental health, and maybe it's not so easy to take self care, or practice self care in that regard. That's one thing, right? But then there are other things, right? Because when I think about that, one of the big things are people like, oh, well, take some time and breathe and, take some time to yourself. But if you're working all day, if you have a family, if you have pets, if you have friends, and you're trying to like take care of this, take care of that, be social, maybe you don't have as much time to yourself as you think. And it's easy to say take the time to yourself, right? But like the world is ever moving. But even if you didn't have all the other things, I had even just like one of those aspects would be enough, right? Because I feel like you could work, right? Let's say you work a 40-hour week, right? Yeah, you have some free time, sure, and you could take that time to yourself. But realistically, you're probably gonna be recovering, and you could argue that that's self care. But when you're exhausted at the end of that, it's not quite the same, right? So when you're trying to take self care and be very intentional with everything, I feel like it's easier said than done. But if you're going to do it, you know, that's math, right? You're figuring out how much time you need to recover your mental health. And maybe that's exercise, maybe that's breathing, maybe that's just not talking to anyone for a bit. But you also have to be in a position to do that, I feel. And yes, you can argue that you can make that position, but it's not always that simple, right? And then that's just a few aspects, right? Because it's like the medicine part, right? For the physical side of things, if you are dealing with a mental health issue, um, and you want to seek professional help, not only will you have to have the time, you also have to have the money and the right insurance. And the way it currently is, at least over here in the States, we don't have the best like insurance for mental health. Though you, as the audience, you just might happen to be lucky enough to have decent insurance, and I hope you do. But it's just like that isn't the norm, and maybe that'll change over time. I hope it does. But for right now, it's like how does that work, right? Because you'll need the money, you'll need the timing to go get the help, and so you might need therapy, you might need medication, and whether we're talking about the time, the money, the resources, that's all math, right? And when you were considering it, it's like, whoa, well, I got to consider these factors. And that is a lot of a lot. It's not so simple, not always. Um, and so, right, just there's a lot to consider with the physical and mental alone, and that all impacts the spiritual, all impacts the emotional, and everything impacts each other. And I think, like, with the mental health stuff in particular, it's an interesting case, right? Because, like, there's so many factors that impact you, right? It's not just like, oh, well, I got this condition or I got that condition and that's it, right? You have to consider the source of this or the source of that. Or at the very least, if something didn't come from this place or that place, something might worsen it. And to elaborate, it's like this. Maybe I'm, X person and I have some sort of condition, right? Um, Maybe seeking help isn't the easiest thing because I might struggle with it financially. Like, or let's be more concrete with it. I very much deal with depression. I don't really hide that, and I don't feel like I should. But with that, right? Um, I find ways to deal with it on my own, and that works for me for the most part. But it's like, what if I wanted to do something else, right? It's not necessarily the easiest thing to do. And I know I'm not the only one who would struggle with that notion. Because it's like, it's easy to say, oh, this person could go to therapy and do this and do that. But you have to consider the financial part, right? That's a big part of a lot of people's struggles. And so not only does that make it more difficult to get help, but having those financial struggles, um, they're 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 part of that mental health, right? They're part of that problem. So it's kind of vicious in a way, right? Um, and I think about that because like a lot of people, it's not that like money can buy happiness, but money can at the very least reduce some of the stress and the struggles, right? Because if you're worrying less about rent and bills and stuff like that, right? You're probably not going to be as miserable. It doesn't always work that way, And dealing with depression, you could be happy, things could be going swimmingly, you could be on top of the world, stuff can just hit you. So it doesn't always work out that way. But for a lot of people, having things lifted off of them financially would help a lot with mental health issues. And if you're in a position where you want to get help, but you're like struggling financially, not being able to afford that help isn't going to help that, right? So it's just things to consider. Um, but I've been talking about this longer than I plan to. But my whole thing is just this, right? When we're dealing with self care, I am all for taking care of yourself mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, whatever the case may be. But I think it's important to acknowledge, and not just for you who might want to practice self care, but for people who want to preach that and maybe not go deeper into it. I think it's important to note that there's a lot of things to consider mathematically speaking, right? Because you have to consider, well, what do we really mean by self care and what's needed physically, what's needed mentally. And you consider things like food, you can consider things like exercise, you consider things like medication, therapy, uh, and on that same thing, like maybe getting like tests for this and that, and just trying to keep up with your mental health. And if you're like me, you got to keep up with your glasses. And we all have mouths; they're crucial to our everyday, so we got to keep up with that. So you're dealing with bills, you're dealing with rent, you're dealing with maybe a doctor visit to get some glasses, or make sure your mouth is okay, or if there is a health issue outside of those things, you have to keep on top of that. So with self-care, it could be a lot of a lot, and there's more to everything that I just said, right? There's so many factors to consider, and it's just something that I hope more people would consider, because like, again, I do promote self-care and I have talked about it, but I want to be a bit more clear how I talk about it, right? I want to be a bit more clear that it is more nuanced than we give it credit for. And right now we're living in a time where, yes, it is getting promoted, and yes, I feel like it should be promoted, but I don't always feel like it's promoted for the right reason, right? Because it won't shock you, but there's a lot of people that make money off of promoting self care. And there's math in that. But what they're selling doesn't always work out so well, right? Because we have a lot to figure out on our own. But even if we know what to do, knowing what to do and knowing what works for us is a whole different thing than being able to do it, right? And I think, again, that's worth considering. But yeah, I went on longer than I planned to, but I hope that you got something out of it. I feel like I have in talking about it, and I hope to have this sort of conversation on a larger scale in the future. So yes, please take care of yourself, but be aware of what that means, and understand that if you can't take care of yourself the way you want to, or the way you feel like you need to, that's more understandable than you think. That's more common than you think. Life is a lot of a lot. And self care isn't as easy as people make it out to be. And I would say, like, for me personally, I know what I want to do, or what I need to do physically and mentally, spiritually, emotionally, all that good stuff to be better in terms of self care. And it's something that I have been very much working on, right? I've put in a lot of time, energy, and effort to think about those things, right? But doing those things is another thing. And I've made a lot of progress, but I have more to go. And I want people to be as happy as they can. I want people to like take proper care of themselves. But again, it's not the easiest thing to do. So if you're struggling with the idea of self care while the world is telling you to practice self care, please know that you're not alone in that struggle. Please know that that is okay. You're fighting a battle that no one else is seeing. And, like doing the best you can. We are all just trying to survive. And sometimes that is the best self care. And I don't know what else to say other than that. So have a great day, and thank you for joining my talk that I recorded at like 4 in the morning about self-care. The irony isn't lost on me. The irony was the point. I got some work to do, you know. I'll see you in the next one. Professor Prime out.